The Skinwalker's cave had become overrun with the bones of its victims. Too many people had either caught a glimpse of it or escaped it, and because of that, the junction of I-160 and Highway 41 in the southwest corner of Colorado was no longer a feasible hunting ground. Armed officers began searching for the creature responsible for the disappearances, as did myth hunters. For weeks, the Skinwalker sat in the mouth of its den, and now it scanned a vast and exhausted desert. The Skinwalker's skin was milky in color and clung tight to its wiry muscles. It draped the hide of a coyote across its back, and he began to transform. A face that resembled half a man, half a coyote, shifted from man to beast. His mouth elongated into a muzzle, and his eyes sank into his skull. Though his face resembled a coyote's, he still possessed human eyes. They captured subtle glints of the silver moon. From behind sheets of greasy and thin black hair, the Skinwalker's eyes shifted. As its hair receded, a gentle wind pushed against it, and then fur bloomed from the pores of its skin. The Skinwalker inched out of its cave as the bones in its legs popped and rearranged themselves, and now, except for its eyes, it had completed its transformation into a coyote. It sat in the maw of its den and howled at the moon. The cloudless sky hung over a vast gray desert, sparse with vegetation and split by I-160. Shallow plumes of dust spiraled in protest of the breeze, and either dissipated in victory or flew westward in defeat as a wandering cloud of dirt. There were few animals skulking about and even fewer people driving on the interstate. Accepting that it must move on to survive, the Skinwalker trotted out of its den and stepped upon the harsh ground of the desert. The whistling breeze pushed against its fur as it sniffed the air and looked at I-160. It followed the interstate southwest until it found a small home occupied by a family of 3 northwest of T. Nazabas Community School, about 8 miles away. Dohasan Yazzie, a man in his late 30s and of Navajo descent, had spent the day toiling on a highway about 30 miles away from home. The labor was grueling, intense. The heat of the desert mingled with hot pavement and made the work so much worse, and left his uniform soaked with sweat. He hung his blue and white striped shirt over the porch railing before entering his home, as he didn't want the smell of sweat or his work to stink up the couch. An orange and yellow vest hung beside the shirt. The Yazzie home was a small 4-bedroom bungalow ranch-style house built in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by a single dirt path carved by those who drive on it. Built in the 60s, this house had few occupants throughout the years. Dohasan and Sarah Yazzie purchased the home in June of 2023, and Dohasan didn't mind that this purchase wiped out their savings, as this was their first home, and they were proud of it. This home, located off of I-160 northwest from T. Nos Pas, served as a middle point between where they wanted to go, closer to his mother Atsa, who lived in Willow Springs, a 2.5-hour drive, and where they were coming from, Thoro, New Mexico. This home, out in the middle of nowhere, is nothing more than a temporary spot on their life journey. Sarah liked that the home was small, and the only way to get to it was to drive on a dirt road for about 10 minutes. From the interstate, the home was hardly visible, and because it was so far away, the sound of traffic didn't reach them. The home was white with a brown tinge because of the desert. There was plenty of yard space and a sprawling mountain range that stood out against the dramatic backdrop of the Arizona sky. She worked from home as a customer service representative. So long as she had a quiet room to work in, a door that could lock, and an internet connection, she could work in the comfort of the spare bedroom they set aside for this purpose. The sun set in the distance as Dohasan stood in the kitchen. Before him simmered a stew. He stirred it every so often. Occasionally, a carrot or a sliver of onion would bubble to the surface. His mother was visiting, and though he didn't like her stew, he knew it was best to entertain her. A chunk of meat floated to the surface. Stirring the pot with a wooden spoon, Dohasan pushed down the meat chunk. He covered the pot with a lid and turned away from it. His daughter, Niabi, bounced on Atsa's knee and relished the moment she shared with her granddaughter. Niabi was a young girl, 7 years old to be exact, who had been enrolled into an online school. Dohasan and Sarah agreed that to compensate for Niabi's lack of social interaction, they would take her to the park often until they figured out a way to get her into school. Fortunately for them, Atsa lived down the block from a park, but, unfortunately for them, Atsa lived more than 2 hours away. Though her hips, feet, and joints were bad, Atsa, she didn't slow down. She didn't know how to, and knew that to feel younger at her old age, she had to keep moving. Gardening, swimming, and power walking kept her somewhat thin and as flexible as a 74-year-old woman can be. She smiled as she held her granddaughter and bounced her off of her knee. She said, "Dohasan, you've vacated this place, right?" Dohasan pressed his eyes shut as he turned away from his mother. He sighed as he pushed his fingers through his jet black hair. Sarah sat up and turned her attention away from the television. Sarah said, "What does that mean?" Glaring at Dohasan, Atsa curled her lips and then bit them. Though he didn't abandon his Navajo roots, he certainly didn't try to learn more about them either. Atsa hissed, "You haven't told her?" "It means to carry out a ceremony to protect this place from Skinwalkers." She pointed at the mountain range clearly visible from the living room window. "You got a sweetheart right here, and you need to watch out for her." Dohasan turned around, opened the soup pot, and stirred it. Navajo culture, his heritage, it all felt like baggage he was forced to carry around. It did not take long for people to figure out that he was a Native American Indian, and when they did, the apologies would come. People apologizing for something they didn't do to someone who didn't suffer. Sorry for this, sorry for that, yet he felt no one truly felt the words they spoke. No. They said what was said because that's what people are supposed to do. Apologize. Though he was grateful for their apologies, at some point in time the apologies sounded like noise. Too many heartless words, too many people who wouldn't donate a dime to a Navajo Indian reservation, or any reservation for that matter, deeply apologetic for the length of their conversation. He wanted something that wasn't prefaced by the color of his skin or the knowledge of his heritage, to feel human rather than an article from the past. That was what he wanted. Atsa understood her son's deeply seated resentment and believed that if he could go through life without anyone asking him about being a Navajo Indian, he would. Not because of shame, but because of the empty bits of sorrow and empathy thrust upon him by strangers. Knowing these truths, she understood why he chose to marry Sarah. Sarah didn't care about any of it and left the past where it belongs, in the past. She's a pale-skinned woman, bushy blonde hair and hazel eyes. She didn't respond to Atsa's stories pertaining to skinwalkers, but expressed curious wonder about her husband's Navajo heritage. Sarah's eyes glazed over when the topic of these tall tales arose, and paid no attention when Atsa discussed Chindis, Nadlihis, skinwalkers, or anything else. Sarah wanted to learn more about traditions, not mythological monsters. Niabi was the only person interested in these eerie stories, but Atsa restrained herself. The tale of her great-great-great-grandfather being a shaman who then became corrupt and transformed into a skinwalker around these parts has no business in the imagination of a 9-year-old. Niabi didn't know about that story, but Dohasan sure did. He was raised on corn, black beans, and ancestral stories. It wasn't until he reached his late teens that he began to question their validity. Once he had moved out, he rejected them entirely. Hating his culture wasn't what he felt, no. Dohasan wanted to move on from the past he wasn't a part of and build a future with his wife. He set the lid back onto the pot and faced his mother. Niabi had stopped bouncing, and Atsa sat still and quiet, staring into the vast expanse of desert beyond the living room window. Atsa felt ice form in her throat as the sun set in the distance. Her skin crawled in ways she couldn't describe. She knew something was out there, watching them. The skinwalker sat beside the brown husk of a tree. Broken by a strike of lightning many months ago, the split tree served as reasonable coverage for the skinwalker. The moon was full and it cast its silver glow across the desert. Dust, thin and sturdy, brushed against the skinwalker's fur coat. It slunk low to the ground as its fur swayed against the wind. Eyes, sharp and focused, remained on the small Yazzie home. Twigs and debris crunched beneath its feet as it crept closer to its target. Though the wind pushed against its fur, the scent of boiled meat enticed its hunger. The skinwalker remained focused on its meal, the Yazzie family. 3 vehicles sat side by side, a 2012 blue Chevy Silverado, a white 2001 Ford Focus, and a gray 2015 Subaru Forester. Of all the vehicles, the Ford Focus had the least amount of rust and still ran quite well. This car belonged to Sarah, a graduation present. Her father bought it brand new and maintained it better than any other man ever could. The Silverado hardly ran right, but it still ran nonetheless. A dream catcher hung on the rear view mirror of the Forester, and 2 feathers were kept in the dash. A small handcrafted Navajo blanket lay rolled up in the back windshield. It hasn't been unrolled for at least 3 years. A sudden pop and the revving of an engine caught the skinwalker's attention. It dropped its body low and lay as close to the ground as it could get. A shabby hatchback darted down the highway, misfiring every so often. Once it had passed, the sound of crickets returned as well as the distant hoots of owls. The skinwalker closed the distance between itself and the 4-bedroom bungalow. Facing the highway was a small porch. The scent of Dohasan's work clothes wafted into the skinwalker's nose. Its eyes closed as it tasted the salty air, and it was then that its mouth began to water. Something about the taste of man excited it. Perhaps it was the hunt and the challenge it brought. The skinwalker approached the vehicles and studied each one. It walked along the porch below the windowsills. With deft paws, it positioned itself just outside the living room window, and there it sat and listened. Dohasan breathed a sigh of relief once he shoveled out the last bit of stew from the pot and into the fourth bowl set out onto the counter. Dinner would be had, and his mother would be off, and then he could finally relax. Carrying one bowl in each hand, he said, "Time to eat. Stew's done a-brewin'." Niabi and Atsa had found a new game to play. Sarah dug out a game called Mousetrap, which had 1/4 of an inch of dust on it. 2 hours had passed since the first game, and the game was now wrapping up. Niabi clenched her fist as she watched the trap descend on Atsa's mouse. She cheered as Atsa playfully moaned that she lost yet again. Sarah cleaned up the game and put it back into the closet before sitting down next to her husband. Niabi and Atsa washed their hands together and played in the sink. Neither Sarah nor Dohasan cared that their daughter and grandmother played for so long in the bathroom. Atsa inquired about Sarah's new job and wished that she could also work from home. Dohasan brought up the topic of his late father, and Atsa was reminded of a time that belongs to the past. She lost her husband 3 years prior due to colon cancer. Times were rough back then, and they still are now. They ate their soup, bickered over who would do the dishes, and ultimately, both Dohasan and Sarah conceded to Atsa's demands. Her words rang in Dohasan's head. "I am not a guest, I am your mother. Sit down and let me do the dishes." Every last dish had been dried and put away, the floor swept clean, and the table wiped off. Niabi sat in her pajamas on the couch, and they were finishing up Tim Burton's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Atsa chuckled as she said, "They'd have to kick me out of that place. I'd come out of there with more than a stomach ache and candy. I'd also have type 2 diabetes." The movie finished, though reluctantly, Niabi was rushed off to bed. Atsa kissed her goodnight and bid farewell to her son and daughter-in-law. With the door at her back, Atsa glanced around one last time and started her car with the key fob. The lights flashed on, and she peered at the daunting mountain range glaring back at her. Her skin began to crawl as she stepped out of the home, and once the door shut, she felt naked in the cool desert air. The sound of television was replaced by gales of wind carried from the west. Her jacket flapped open as her hair was pushed around. Left idling, the Forester doors clicked as they unlocked. Atsa walked out from the porch and toward her car. For reasons she couldn't explain, her heart began to race, and she felt as though tunnel vision was circling in on her. Atsa glanced over her shoulder, only to see tumbleweeds passing across the desert. As she grabbed the handle of the Forester door, she looked into the back of her car. Nothing was there. A sigh escaped her lungs as she opened the door and sat down. She was wrong. Something was there, and she had yet to discover it. Dohasan and Sarah finally had a moment to relax. Though they had only one child, that one child was still a handful. A few hours had passed since Atsa left, and Dohasan thought nothing of it. He stood in the bathroom in front of a large vanity mirror, brushing his teeth. Work begins tomorrow at 5 in the morning, and knowing that it's already 11 at night, he has accepted that tomorrow is going to be a groggy and painful day. Sarah stood in front of the bedroom window, staring at 2 blaring red lights in the distance. For a moment, she thought she could hear a horn, but wasn't too sure. She turned around and called for her husband. Sarah said, "Honey, come here. Do you hear a car horn?" Dohasan left the bathroom and crossed to the other side of their bedroom towards Sarah. He stopped brushing, and for a moment, he heard it. He said, Are those lights? Is that a car?" While searching for his phone, he spat out the toothpaste into the sink and rinsed his mouth with water. He called his mother, but she did not answer. Sarah hurried out of the bathroom, only to return a moment later with a pair of binoculars. Dohasan had dialed again to no avail. In the few brief moments he spent trying to call his mother, Sarah studied the two red lights. Her stomach sank once she understood what she was looking at. She passed the binoculars to her husband. He looked through them and shouted, That's a Forester. That's Mom's car." The Skinwalker had already picked her bones clean. All that remained was Atsa's dried out skin. It studied the trail it left behind in the desert. A shallow pool and speckles of crimson were near the Forester, leaving behind a trail to its new den. It knew that it would need to cover that trail. As the Skinwalker sat, he transformed back into his human form. The skin of the walker was milk white, and he had very long black hair. Eyes, deep and brown, scanned the desert as he felt the brush of dust pass between his fingers. This man, a hunter, a shaman, a murderer, has forgotten who he was. His name, he doesn't know. Family, forgotten. Heritage, erased. Does he know that he is no longer a man, but a beast in disguise? Does he know that he hunts his descendants, that he has taken the life of his distant granddaughter? He does not and could not. The only thing this Skinwalker knows is hunger, a hunger that can never be satisfied, a fitting punishment for the crime he committed many lifetimes ago. Though he is unaware of his past, he is alert to the present. He crawled deep into the wet cave and removed the skin of a bear. Slipping its skull over his head, the Skinwalker covered himself with the bear's skin. Patches of fur were missing, and the edges of the dried out skin were frayed. Once the bear's skin touched his own, his bones began to shift. Fur grew from the pores of his skin as his bones rearranged. Muscles expanded while he hunched over and emitted guttural groans. His hands swelled as his nails became black claws and heavy. The Skinwalker moaned in agony, at first resembling a man and then a bear. His transformation was complete. He left his cold and damp cave to erase his trail. Dohasan slipped on his work boots and a thin jacket. He stood in the doorway, glaring at the Forester, a quarter-mile down the road. The horn blared much louder now that he had opened the door, and the night air felt cool against his skin. Carrying his phone, flashlight, and a crowbar, he marched toward the Forester. Glancing over his shoulder, he noticed Sarah standing in the doorway, leaning to one side, arms folded, waiting. His phone buzzed in his hand. A new text message had been received. It read, "Not going anywhere, honey. Don't worry." Dohasan nodded toward his wife and slipped his phone into his pocket. As the distance between him and the Forester closed, He aimed the flashlight toward the vehicle and clicked it on. A yellow beam of light illuminated the vast desert, revealing small rocks, bramble bushes, dead trees, and cacti, none of which gave any clues to Atsa's whereabouts. He pointed the flashlight at the forester, slowing his pace as he cautiously flanked to the right of it. The flashlight revealed little and told no secrets about Atsa's disappearance. As he surveyed the front of the vehicle, he realized that the front bumper was in good condition, suggesting that perhaps the forester had rolled into the boulder. While studying the interior of the forester, he saw a stick wedged into the seat and pushing into the horn. Though he felt relief knowing his mother's vehicle wasn't involved in a crash, he felt this sour feeling in his stomach. He wondered why the stick was positioned in such a way and how the vehicle veered so far off the interstate. Dohasan opened the passenger door and broke the stick in half. The blaring horn ceased, and then silence remained. Scanning the seat and searching the dash for clues, he found nothing. Not a single scratch or torn seat. Nothing. However, the deep guttural groans of a bear manifested behind him. Dohasan ignored the sound he heard because bears weren't too common in Arizona, and he guessed that it was probably a man or his imagination. A second groan pierced the silence and captured his attention, for it wasn't the groan of a man, but of a bear. The cool night air now chilled the marrow in his bones as his stomach turned to ice. As his hands trembled, he readied his crowbar. Footsteps, heavy and thick, circled behind him. He blindly swung his crowbar and hit nothing. Looking in every direction he possibly could, he searched for the bear, but found only desert. Dohasan closed his eyes and exhaled. A groan, deep and furious, came from his left. Wafting into his nose was a musky, earthy odor. The scent was quite foul and caused him to slightly gag. He shone the flashlight in the direction of the scent and sounds. A bear stood 10 feet ahead of him. Human-like eyes stared at him. They reflected the flashlight and appeared to possess a faint glow. Dohasan felt his stomach drop because he knew that what was in front of him wasn't a beast. Bear eyes are typically dark brown or amber, and the irises stretch beyond the bounds of the eyelid. Dohasan saw the whites of the creature's eyes, its pupils, its iris, and felt it was a human staring at him. He reminded himself of the stories he tried to forget. Though he did not want to admit it, he knew something far fiercer than a bear was hunting him. It was a skinwalker. Squeezing the crowbar, Dohasan swung it to and fro, striking the bear in the side and across the face. A cracked tooth exploded from the bear's mouth and skittered across the desert floor. As the bear towered over him, he felt hopeless because the beast remained unfazed by his attacks. Suddenly, a deafening roar washed over Dohasan as the skinwalker howled with rage. He fell to his back, turned around, and began to flee. As he looked forward, his home came into view. His lung ached as he sprinted toward the desert until, at last, he arrived home to Sarah still standing in the doorway. She said, "I saw you go behind that boulder. Is everything okay?" Dohasan turned and scanned the desert. Nothing was out there, not a coyote or a hawk or even a bear, nothing. He scratched his head and tried to figure out what had just happened. Uncertainty and confusion consumed him as he passed through the doorway. Sarah quietly closed the door and locked it. She said, "Honey, is everything okay?" Dohasan filled a glass with water and sat down at the kitchen table. He couldn't find the words he needed to express how he felt, and did his best to mumble through his incoherent thoughts. He said, Car's fine. She's out there. A bear. I saw a bear." He tilted the cup onto his lips. "A bear. In Arizona. A black bear." Sarah said, "Keep it down. Niabi is sleeping, and I know bears aren't very common here, but they do still occasionally come around." Dohasan sneered as he said, "No, I'm sure they come around, but to happen upon one in the desert by my mom's car? Come on, not likely. That thing, it had human eyes. I can't explain it any other way than that. Human eyes." "Sarah, we need to call the police right now." He sat silent for a moment as Sarah walked away from the kitchen and called the police. He digested the event which unfolded. A bear with human eyes, the sudden disappearance of his mother. It all seemed too difficult to believe. He drank his water and turned away from Sarah. Once she hung up the phone, she said, "Honey, I'm sure there's an explanation for all of this. Maybe a snake was in your mom's car and it scared the crap out of her and she got out and tried to run away from it. I don't know." Dohasan trembled as he sat. He did not have an answer to the questions which beckoned him, and neither did Sarah. There, at the kitchen table, they sat for a long and quiet hour. Sarah filled a small cup with sleep aid and passed it to her husband. He drank it and soon fell into a restless slumber. Three cups of coffee and a Red Bull couldn't shake off the grogginess Dohasan felt as he drove to work. Sarah had cooked eggs, bacon, hash browns, and buttered toast, a gesture to make her husband feel better. He enjoyed her meal, but the side effects of the sleep aid and lack of good sleep kept him on the edge of returning to slumber once more. As the day progressed and he began to wake up, the eerie sense that something was wrong returned to him. He counted the hours as they passed by. 8 in the morning. No return phone call from his mother. 9, 10, 11, 2, 3, and now 5 in the evening. Still no phone call. Before he hung up his construction hat, he checked his phone one last time. Not a single missed call. Yet, he had called her phone more than a dozen times. Sarah had called Atsa too, if only to subdue the anxiety which had started to gnaw on her. The stories of skinwalkers and the tales of Atsa told began to creep into her mind. What if they were real? What if a skinwalker took her? She thought of those things and more as she tidied up the home while waiting for work to come to her. Working from home, answering customer service calls had its perks, but sometimes no one called and there was nothing to do. At 6 in the evening, Dohasan came home from work and dragged himself through the doorway and toward the kitchen. He patted Niabi on the head as he passed and rubbed Sarah's back. He ran cold water from the faucet and proceeded to catch it with his hands. The cool water felt nice, refreshing, and once he had filled his hands, he splashed it onto its face. He said, "This feels like a dream." Sarah nodded and stirred the potato salad she had been working on for the previous half hour. It was finished now, but at least stirring this thing gave her something to do. Sarah wrapped her arms around his waist and squeezed him tight. She said, "Maybe it is, maybe it is." A few days passed, and Atsa still hadn't called. Dohasan suspected he knew why, but refused to admit it. The Skinwalker slunk deep into the stomach of its cave. There, it groped for hides, dried skin, and other garments it could wear to assume a new form. Its collection has grown over the years and consisted of coyote, bear, and wolf hides, and even a cloak made of crow's feathers. It passed through its den and glanced at each hide, thinking of a plan that would ensure the capture of its prey. He brushed his fingertips against dried human skin. What the Skinwalker needed to deceive people was within arm's reach, but now it needed something else. Fingering through folded sheets of skin as though they were sheets of paper, the Skinwalker searched for its newest addition, the dried out skin of Atsa. He removed it from the pile and unfolded it. Her hair brushed against the ground as the Skinwalker studied its newest prize. As the scent of earth and desert trespassed into his nose, he draped Atsa's skin over his shoulders. The bones in his body shifted, and he seemed to shrink. He looked like Atsa, and he knew that Niabi would think the same. Dohasan checked his phone as he sat at the dinner table. He waited for the police station to return his call. A week had passed since Atsa's disappearance, and he hadn't heard from anyone since he made the initial report. Once the police report was filed, the car was towed away. Since Dohasan hasn't heard anything, he can only assume his mother's Forester now belongs to the tow company. Sleep hasn't been easy for him either. Maybe 4 hours a night, and after the first 2 days, his sleep aids stopped working. One thing that helped was imagining his mother was somewhere else, perhaps at a beach or hiking a trail in the forest. Atsa enjoyed that sort of thing. Knowing this provided a sliver of comfort. He trembled as he thought about the harsh reality and what it would mean for him, his daughter, his wife, if Atsa doesn't call soon. How would he tell Niabi? How? Sarah, too, had felt the pull of worry, and it kept her up just as much as it did Dohasan. Once dinner was cooked and ate and showers were done, Dohasan and Niabi sat on the couch and watched a cartoon. The demands of highway construction weighed on his body, and he nodded off as they sat on the couch. After the movie finished and Niabi woke her father, he saw this as good a time as any to go to sleep. He kissed Niabi goodnight and left for his bedroom. The door quietly clicked shut as Niabi made herself a glass of chocolate milk. Sensing her husband's unease, Sarah joined him in the bedroom, with the intention of comforting him for a little while. She wrangled him in her embrace and rested her head atop his chest. And there they talked until eventually they both fell asleep by mistake. Niabi glanced at the clock on the wall and noted it was 9:32 p.m. She sat on the edge of her seat and turned the volume down. She channel surfed in search of something that could catch her attention while thinking about her grandmother. Niabi grabbed a bag of corn chips and began to snack on them. 10 minutes passed, then 30, and then 2 hours. As she sat in the comfort of the living room, a subtle whimper caught her attention. She knew the voice, and it pleaded for help. Listening and turning down the volume of the television, she waited. This voice, carried through the living room window, was barely audible. Niabi focused her attention on the origin of the sound, which seemed to come from just outside the window, but she wasn't too sure. Suddenly, her name was spoken, and she realized why the voice sounded familiar. It was Atsa. Niabi, the winds seemed to whisper, but even still, the owner of the voice was absent. She knew it sounded like her grandmother, but she couldn't understand how or why. For all she knew, Atsa had left almost a week ago, and Niabi did not know about her disappearance. Louder, much louder than before, her name wafted through the living room window once again. Whispers of pain emerged, and then silence. Niabi tiptoed toward the window and looked out of it. Empty desert and a mountain range far off in the distance. Atsa's car was gone, but the tracks it left behind were still present. Niabi thought about the forester, her parents' lack of sleep, and the phone calls which were unanswered and unreturned. She thought of these things and began to wonder if her grandmother had wandered off and gotten lost. Though Dohasan and Sarah tried to protect her from the reality of the situation, Niabi had a knack for figuring these things out. She arose to her feet and entered the kitchen. On top of the counter and plugged into the wall were both of Sarah and Dohasan's cell phones. She grabbed them both and scrolled through the text messages. Once there, she had read a combined of 49 texts. "Where are you? Are you okay? Why is your car out here?" All valid questions which remain unread. Niabi set the phone down and thought for a moment. Why was her car stuck in the desert, and why hasn't Atsa responded to anything? Calls, texts, anything. She dialed Atsa and the phone went straight to voicemail. She thought, maybe her phone is dead. She opened the Messages app again and typed, "Hey Grandma, everyone is worried about you. Are you outside? Are you okay?" The message was delivered without issue, and there it sat, unread. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow in volume as she waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15 minutes passed before Niabi set the phone down. From outside the window, a whisper returned. "Niabi, help me." Niabi stood straight up and felt a cold chill wash over her. The hairs on her arm rose as the beat of her heart increased. The voice returned. repeating itself. Help me, help me, help me, until at last it faded into the backdrop of a sudden gale of wind. Niabi said, I should get my mom and dad, right? They can help you. She waited for a response, something to give her permission to wake her parents. The desert which she stared at seemed cold under the faint glow of a pale blue silverish moon. Winds carried from the west blew past her, stirring the settled dirt on the ground and highway. Except for the gusts of wind, silence filled the air. Not a coyote howled or a crow cawed. As far as Niabi could tell, all the animals had gone to sleep. She listened and discovered that crickets even stopped their music for the night. Had she known better, she would have perceived this eerie silence as an ominous warning, but she did not. She viewed a quiet world as a world at peace. The animals were quiet because they were sleeping, and that much was true for the crickets. Hiding in fear and remaining dead silent so as not to be found did not register in her mind. Niabi said, Should I go get my mom and dad? Silence. Only silence was her answer. She left the couch and tiptoed to her parents' bedroom. Snoring loud enough to be heard from the kitchen created an awkward feeling in her. If she woke them, she wondered if she would be in trouble and guessed that maybe she would. As they snored, she quietly walked to the door and opened it. She said, Grandma? Gusts of wind and the rustle of dust was all she heard. Nothing more, nothing less. Niabi closed the door and walked to the edge of the porch. Surveying the desert, she tried to find the forester, even though she knew it had been hauled away. Footprints, tire trails, anything that would indicate a path which led to her grandma. Once she had finished surveying the desert, she tried to remember from where the voice called to her. She reminded herself that it came from the window in the living room, which was on the opposite side of the house. She left the porch and snuck past the Silverado in focus. Once she arrived at the living room window, she searched for clues. Something about 20 feet away appeared to be buried in the dirt, half of a shoe. Niabi noticed it and quickly approached it. As she studied it, her mouth fell open as she realized the shoe belonged to her grandmother. Niabi looked up in shock and scanned the rest of the desert. Something perhaps 30 feet away caught her attention. Something no larger than a shoe she just found half buried in the dirt. Niabi glanced at her home and then at the other item, 20 feet away from her home and 30 feet away from the next clue. She didn't realize this trail led to the mouth of the Skinwalker's cave, or that there was even a Skinwalker lurking about. She cared only for her grandmother, and it was this compassion that the Skinwalker took advantage of. She knew that if she could help and not wake her parents, or at least find her grandmother, she would feel much better. Perhaps her parents would celebrate her victory. Unfortunately, those delusions served as the motivation for her decision. Niabi closed the distance between her and the other item. Once she dug it out, she realized it was the other shoe. Now, 50 feet away from home, she felt vulnerable in the open desert. If an animal were to corner her, say a coyote, She knew she wouldn't be able to outrun it, but something flashed against the moonlight in the distance. A necklace, gleaming silver and encrusted with gems. Imitation rubies, sapphires, and emeralds glimmered against the moon. Niabi began to shiver as she stood in the desert, holding the shoes. Her teeth chattered as she turned around once more. Home, not quite far away, but far enough away to cause a nervous chill in her stomach. She pressed on anyway and scooped up the necklace. Dirt, sand, and speckles of dried crimson were on it. Niabi tried to clean it off as best as she could, but failed to do so. As the wind pushed against her and the silence of the night enveloped her, she saw her grandmother's scarf far off in the distance. It flapped against the winds, and it sat at the mouth of the cave. Niabi sucked in a deep breath and nodded. She whispered, "That's it. Grab that and go home." Niabi ran to the scarf, and now the house appeared to be a speckle on the horizon. Once she turned around, she realized how far she had gone from home, all in pursuit of following her grandmother's trail of things. As she picked up the scarf, the Skinwalker began to whimper. Niabi heard her grandmother's cries. The Skinwalker, using Atsa's voice, said, "Help." Niabi stared into the cave and saw what appeared to be Atsa lying on her back, pinned beneath a rock. She examined her grandmother and realized her leg had been broken. Desperate to help, she entered the cave. Sarah heard her. Somehow she heard the lone, terrifying scream of Niabi. Her eyes sprang open and her heart sank. Niabi's scream reverberated through her skull, and whether it be instinct or intuition or something else, she immediately knew something was wrong. She sat up in bed and looked at the clock. It read 11:53 p.m. She groaned and left her bedroom and looked in Niabi's room. An empty bed was all she seen. Her stomach turned as she paced through the kitchen, surveyed the living room, and quickly walked down the hall. She whispered, "Niabi, sweetheart." Searching each closet in Niabi's bedroom again, she found no trace of her. She began to yell and then scream, "Dohasan, Niabi's gone!" Dohasan sat up in bed, still in a dreamlike haze. His mother missing, the scream of Niabi in his head, and now Sarah's anguished cries. She continued, "She's gone. Get up. Call the police." She stammered about. "I'll call the police. Oh my God, please, no, no, no." Dohasan rubbed his eyes and tried to wake up. He couldn't. Sarah began to hyperventilate as she tried to speak coherently into the phone. Young girl, mixed, half white, half Native American, black hair, brown eyes, 4'2", 9 years old. Dohasan climbed out of bed and entered the kitchen. His phone buzzed and rang. He closed his eyes and swallowed the knot of air in his throat. Amber alert. Niabi Yazzie, 9 years old, black hair, 4'2". Last seen at home. Dohasan knew what the Amber Alert entailed. Seeing his own daughter described in this alert felt surreal. Sarah flung open the door and surged outside. Dohasan followed her out of the home and looked at the mountain range. Something he couldn't describe boiled in the pit of his stomach. He wondered if his mother and little girl were out there, in the cave far off in the distance. There was no possible way of telling, but he felt uneasy nonetheless. The police came, took a report, and investigated the surroundings around the house. Once the sun rose, a crew of 20 people came, as well as a news crew, and they searched the area for Niabi. Strange enough, they investigated the cave in which the Skinwalker hid, but they found nothing. Sarah, who hadn't been doing too well since Atsa's disappearance, she began to come apart at the seams. Sleep, no matter how many aids she took, could not come. The thoughts of Niabi lost in the desert, why she went into the desert, and what's come of her kept her awake. Coyotes, foxes, and all the other dangerous creatures which call the desert home flashed in her mind every so often. At times, she would be burdened with this particular scenario. Niabi, cornered by a rabid coyote or fox, bitten, and the rest left for a morbid horror story. Dohasan felt much the same, but his intrusive thoughts didn't consist of random animals, but of a single entity. He knew the Skinwalker was out there and had Niabi in its possession. Though the memory of the bear's eyes glaring into him was still clear, the news of Niabi missing began to scrub away the finer details of that night. He wondered if he really saw human eyes, or if in a moment of panic he believed in his mother's ghost stories because he wanted to. To believe his mother had been taken by a Skinwalker made his stomach twist. It was much better to think that his mother simply got out of her forester and wandered around in the desert than to believe she had been taken by a Skinwalker. The tires weren't flat. The engine didn't reveal any signs of leakage. Everything was as it should have been, yet nothing made sense. Much like then and just like now, his daughter walking into the desert near midnight did not make any sense either. None at all. Two days had passed, 3 days, then 4, then 5, and once a week had passed. Neither Dohasan or Sarah knew what to do. They had gotten little sleep for the past few days. As the hours moved into the void of the past, he felt something ominous inside of him growing. The Skinwalker had to be responsible for these disappearances, and he wanted to communicate that with Sarah. but he didn't know how. He had spent most of his life denouncing his heritage, the Skinwalker, and hiding from his Navajo roots and the lore associated with it. Regardless, he knew he had to speak his mind, but tried to figure out how to do it with care. The Skinwalker climbed up from the bottom of its damp cave. In its arms was its collection, bundles of folded skin tied together by frayed string. The Skinwalker receded into the bowels of the cave when it heard the police come, and there it stayed so long as it could hear them searching. 3 days passed before the police decided the cave was not worth exploring and moved on. Once the Skinwalker emerged from the bleak cave, it strung up its newest addition to the collection and dried it out with salt and herbs. At the edge of the cave's mouth, the Skinwalker sat with its legs folded. His eyes surveyed the vast expanse of desert and the pinprick which was the Yazzie home. In a language long forgotten, the Skinwalker thought about 2 more people, 2 more meals. It planned for what would come next once the family had been consumed, and guessed that it could do what it's always done: prey on those unfortunate enough to have a car break down in the middle of the interstate. As it sat, it gazed at the moon shining through the eye sockets of its new catch. It wondered how it could lure the mother away. The moon sank over the horizon, and once the morning sun arose, the Skinwalker descended into the cave. Two weeks have passed since Niabi's disappearance, and 3 weeks for Atsa. Dohasan and Sarah sat at the kitchen table. Neither of them felt like cooking. For the past few days they have ordered in, and Dohasan had called off work. Though his boss understood and sympathized, he was becoming frustrated. Too many absences. Tonight, they ate deli-made sandwiches and chips. As he chewed on his sandwich, Dohasan summoned the courage to say something he meant to say a long time ago. He said, "I think we need to leave. Right now." Sarah set her sandwich down. "And if Niabi returns?" "She's lost out there, not dead." Dohasan clenched his jaw and looked at his meal. He knew she had already perished, and why. He didn't know how to broach the conversation of Niabi no longer being alive, but the thought of even speaking those words made his skin curl. Instead, he thought of saving himself and his wife. Dohasan said, "I think we should leave. Not even pack up our things, just take what we have on our back right now and go." Sarah sat up and nearly shouted, "Go where? All of our savings went to the down payment of this house that you wanted. What about Niabi, huh? She will find her way back home." Dohasan interrupted her. "Sarah, she's not coming back. A Skinwalker took her." Once the words left his mouth, he felt flushed and hot. His skin turned pale as his stomach twisted. Sarah threw her sandwich at the table and stammered into the bedroom as she said, "I thought you don't believe in those ghost stories. She's not dead because Skinwalkers aren't real." Sarah returned with a backpack and began to rummage through the utility drawer. She continued, I cannot believe you would even suggest we abandon our daughter. She's out there. I'm going to find her and bring her home." Sarah piled a box of batteries, switchblade, flashlight, bear mace, small first aid kit, 2 bottles of water, and a box cutter into the pack. She glared at Dohasan as she said, "You can either come or stay." He didn't know how to respond. Conflicting emotions boiled in his heart as he thought about the possibility that his daughter wandered off and needed to be discovered, but also considered the fact that the police had already searched the desert. How could Sarah do a more thorough job of searching for Niabi than a team of 20 trained professionals? Dohasan said, "Sarah, the police have already searched out there. I don't think there's anything you can do that hasn't already been done. I mean, think about it." Sarah's eyes began to water. They already searched out there. Niabi isn't out there. Sarah felt a white-hot rage flash through her. She closed the distance between herself and Dohasan and beat his chest as she bellowed, "Then where is she?" He wrapped his arms around her and held her as she collapsed in the doorway. The backpack fell to the ground and the contents within spilled out. A few days have passed between Sarah's breakdown and now. The Skinwalker patrolled the interior of its cave, developing a plan to lure Sarah away. Knowing that Dohasan would meet it with force and already failing to dispose of him, the Skinwalker surmised there was only one path it could take to draw Sarah from her husband: dreams or nightmares. The Skinwalker draped a cloak stitched together from dozens of crows across his shoulder, the bones in his body rearranged as ebony feathers tore through his skin. As he shrank in size, his eyes became small and beady, while his face elongated into a beak. Legs, short and resembling slender stalks, replaced the human legs he once had. Its transformation was complete. It hopped to the edge of the cave and took flight. It flew to the edge of Dohasan's bedroom window and peered in. Dreamcatcher, white ash, or any totems that would forbid its entry were absent. The Skinwalker perched itself on the windowsill and stared at Sarah. From the back of its skull to the front, the Skinwalker felt a pressure begin to manifest, and at once it projected itself from where it was into Sarah's dream. The skies were dark, and Niabi cried far off into the distance. Sarah searched for her in vain, wandering aimlessly through a desert that grew in size with each step she took. The Skinwalker noted this and knew that it had to wake her up. Its plan was simple: make the dream a reality, and make reality a dream. The Skinwalker flew to the edge of the cave and bellowed for Sarah. It said, "Mom, Mommy." Sarah heard the voice. The Skinwalker repeated, "I fell deep into it, the cave. I fell in. Help me, please." Sarah rushed toward the cave, but the sand beneath her didn't move. Sarah screamed, "Honey, I'm stuck." The Skinwalker howled, "You're dreaming. Wake up." Sarah's eyes peeled open, and the Skinwalker was returned to reality. It painted the skies with purples, reds, and blues. It distorted reality, painting it into a dream. Sarah rolled over in bed and felt the floorboards beneath her feet sink. An illusion, all an illusion. She said, I'm still dreaming." But she was wrong, deadly wrong. The Skinwalker projected Niabi's voice from the cave. It said, "Mommy, you're awake, come here." Sarah glanced out the window and saw a crow with human eyes watching her. Her heart sank as she turned away from it. She left the bedroom. She set her hands on the countertop, and they passed through as though they were made of water. The walls of the home appeared to be blown away like sand, and now she stood in the heart of the desert before a single doorway. Sarah couldn't explain where she was or how she got there, but she passed through the doorway and ran toward the cave. The sand no longer shifted beneath her feet, and the mouth of the cave seemed to yawn as she approached it. The Skinwalker used Niabi's voice and pleaded, "Please, it's hurting me." The sky above resembled a painting, and rays of the moonlight were sharp in contrast. Sarah charged forward, desperate to save her daughter in what she thought was a horrible nightmare. Dohasan felt her climb out of bed, and just before the crow fluttered away, he saw the human eye of the hideous creature. He knew what was happening, but Sarah was too fast for him to stop her. By the time he awoke and noticed what was happening, she had already crossed the highway and was too far gone. He searched through his closet for a pouch of white ash his mother had given him. White ash to a skinwalker is what a silver bullet is to a werewolf. He needed the ash and knew he would need to spread it out onto something that could inflict a mortal wound. Under the bed, in the closets, under the sinks, everywhere he searched for the white ash, he found it tucked away at the bottom of his dresser. He didn't know how it got there, but he was glad he found it. Though the ash inside was gray and resembled the color and texture of charcoal ash, the importance of this sacred item resides in its ability to purify anything it may touch. Sacred and pure, Atsa's grandmother crafted this particular batch of white ash. Juniper had been collected from a forest long since forgotten. Once the needles had been collected, they were dried out and burnt with cedar, tobacco, sweetgrass, sage, and corn pollen in a sacred fire pit. After burning commenced and all that remained was ash, it was collected and placed in a sacred jar. Many tribes did not bless their ash, while others did. As for the tribe in which this ash came from, the jar, along with the others, received a blessing from the tribe's shaman, thereby concluding its purification. Once the ceremony commenced, each tribe's person received their portion of ash to use or pass on to the next generation. Fortunately for the Yazzie family, there wasn't a use for it until now. Dohasan had found a fireman's axe behind the house next to a short stack of logs. He didn't plan on using it, but figured it would serve as a good sleight of hand. As he stood on the porch and Sarah walked out of sight, he smeared white ash across his forearms. The Skinwalker pleaded, "Mom, help! Down here!" As Sarah drew closer to the mouth of the cave, she said, "Coming, baby." As she entered the cave, the dream world ceased, and the Skinwalker wrapped its fingers beneath Sarah's chin and placed his other hand atop her head. Sarah dropped to the floor, limp and pale. As the Skinwalker stood over her body, it noticed Dohasan approaching in the distance. It frowned because it could see the axe and smell the white ash, but its hunger drove it into the heart of conflict. The Skinwalker rummaged through its collection and removed the flayed hide of a wolf. It wrapped itself with its skin and studied the intruder. Dohasan closed the distance between himself and the cave as he started shouting. In a language nearly forgotten, he spoke with Navajo tongue, cursing the Skinwalker and stating his revenge. As he stood before the mouth of the cave, wind pushed against him, and the head of a gray wolf emerged. Its eyes were human, and Dohasan knew that it was the Skinwalker. It cautiously descended the small ridge leading into the cave and stood 100 feet in front of Dohasan. Its grayish coat swayed against the wind as it stood silent and still, watching. The Skinwalker could smell the white ash, but did not know where it was. It assumed Dohasan had smeared the axe with it, but wasn't too sure. Because of that, it knew it would need to somehow break his arm. Dohasan did not falter as he stood before the beast, staring into its eyes. He raised his axe, and the Skinwalker laid down on its belly and then rolled over. It twisted in the dirt and began to play. Rage boiled in part of his body as he watched the Skinwalker carelessly dismiss him as a threat. It dawned on him then that that was its goal. He approached the Skinwalker, and it seemed to grow in size as he came closer. The wolf, once as tall as his hips, seemed to be as tall as his chest now. Once there was only 40 feet between him and the wolf, it towered slightly taller than him. The scent of white ash became more intense, enough to where the Skinwalker considered fleeing, but his hunger persisted. Feed, feed. Dohasan sprinted toward the wolf and swung his axe. The wolf sprang to the right and dodged his blow. Once he regained his composure, he swung yet again, and the wolf dodged his attack. As he stood, leaning against his axe, the Skinwalker paced around him. The white ash, it knew it had to avoid it, but wasn't sure where to bite. It scanned Dohasan's legs, arms, and hands. Nothing appeared to be on him other than sweat. Dohasan recovered his strength and pursued the wolf, only to swing and miss once again. As he fell over, the Skinwalker nipped at his calf and tasted crimson. Instincts took over. and the Skinwalker thought of nothing else. It nipped at Dohasan's other calf and licked his crimson off its own lips. The hunger grew, and the lines between calculated hunting and a frenzy began to blur. It wanted it. It needed it. The hunger was too much. The Skinwalker leaped forward and tried to bite Dohasan's stomach to no avail. He swung the handle of the axe down and broke the Skinwalker's muzzle. It bemoaned and now felt only rage. It barked and howled as crimson liquid dripped from its nose. It charged for Dohasan once more. He fell to his back and positioned his right arm forward to catch the force of the Skinwalker's bite. As its teeth pierced Dohasan's flesh, the Skinwalker felt it. The white-hot ash smeared upon his skin. Its mouth burned and it released him immediately. The world began to blur as its gums felt on fire. Dohasan wobbled from side to side. The Skinwalker tried to smell the man, but was met with the odor of white ash. It whimpered away, but Dohasan was too quick. He swung the axe and clipped the wolf at the top of its paws. As the Skinwalker began to stumble, it abandoned its wolf form and tried to crawl away. Dohasan frowned as the wolf transformed back into a man, and for the first time, he saw the Skinwalker for what it truly was, a writhing old man. The human eyes he saw on a bear, a crow, and this wolf were all the same. While the Skinwalker tried to inch away from Dohasan, its mouth began to spew smoke. The white ash still burned, and it will not stop until there is nothing left to cleanse. Dohasan stood over the Skinwalker and swung the axe into its head. As crimson erupted from the point of entry, it spoke in a lost language. It didn't matter at this point. Dohasan knelt beside the Skinwalker and pried its mouth open. He dumped a heap of white ash into the Skinwalker's mouth, and it hissed as it burned through its throat and cheeks. It screamed and kicked and tried to fight back, but it couldn't. Dohasan hacked at the Skinwalker's legs and arms, severing them from its body. The Skinwalker gazed into the open sky above as he watched the clouds pass. No sooner his eyes burned away, along with the rest of his body. Dohasan knelt in the desert, lost for words, and without so much as an idea of what to do. He scanned the desert and looked at the cave. He entered the cave and found his wife lying on her stomach. Dohasan called the police and waited for them to come. It's been 5 years since those horrific events. A proper funeral was given to his mother, daughter, and wife. Even now, he still wears his wedding band. The world seemed a bit brighter today, but not by much. Once the police realized he wasn't the murderer, they left him alone and allowed him to live his life. He moved from Arizona to Florida and found something resembling peace there. All things considered, peace can never be found, but he found something as close to it as it could be. The sun was high, clouds were sparse, and he sat at a pool, a perk because of his new apartment. He examined his wedding ring and looked across the way. He will always love Sarah and will always miss his daughter, but he knows that both of them want him to be happy. He knows that Sarah loves him enough to allow him to love again and would not be offended by what he is about to do. He slipped off his wedding band and put it into his pocket. He decided early this morning that it would go into the safe, and there it would stay. Loneliness has gotten the best of him lately, and today he would start to remedy that. Sitting opposite of him was a young, slender woman with wavy black hair, perhaps Navajo descent, perhaps not. Dohasan noticed she's been glancing at him, and he thinks she is breathtaking. No wedding ring, no engagement ring, or even a promise ring, or anything else. He stood up and made his way for her. Her eyes fell upon him as he approached. He said, "Hey, hi, my name is Dohasan, and I'm new to these apartments. Just moved in last week, actually. Nice to meet you. Are you single?" The girl extended her hand, and he shook it. Yeah. My name is Dakota. It means friend in Navajo." Dohasan smiled. He pointed at himself. Top of mountain. "Anyway, you didn't answer my question. Are you single?" Dakota smiled. "I'm free tonight, if that's what you mean." Dohasan laughed. Yes. That is what I mean, yep.